The moment my mother-in-law laughed in that courtroom, I knew exactly what she was thinking. She thought she had won. She thought the 23 years I'd spent married to her son were about to be erased with a single stroke of a judge's pen. She sat 3 rows behind her son, my soon-to-be ex-husband David, wearing that cream-colored Chanel suit she saved for what she called important occasions. Her lawyer had told her this would be quick. Her son had told her I wouldn't fight back. And the private investigator she'd hired 6 months ago had told her I had nothing. No assets in my name, no income of my own, no family to back me up. She was right about all of that. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was the one thing I'd kept hidden from that family for 23 years. The one file that was about to walk through the courtroom doors in about 90 seconds. But before I tell you what happened when the judge said my name, you need to understand how I ended up there in the first place. Because this story doesn't start in a courtroom, it starts with a promise I made to my dying father in 1998. The setup. My name is Margaret Hayes. Most people who know me from the neighborhood call me Maggie. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Whitmore, called me the girl David settled for, and she said it loud enough for me to hear, at least once a month, for 23 years. I met David Whitmore in the spring of 2001. I was 24 years old, home on leave, sitting alone at a coffee shop in Alexandria, Virginia, still wearing my utility uniform because I'd driven straight from the base. He walked in, ordered a black coffee, and asked if the seat across from me was taken. He was handsome in that soft, Ivy League way, a lawyer, 3 years older than me, from a family that had money going back 4 generations. 6 months later, he proposed. And this is where the promise comes in. Because my father, a Vietnam veteran who'd raised me alone after my mother died, had made me swear something on his deathbed in 1998. He'd told me, Maggie, when you meet a man, don't lead with the uniform. Let him love you first. Because if he can't love the woman without the rank, he'll never respect the rank without the woman. I kept that promise. When David proposed, he knew I'd been in the army. He knew I was a captain. What he didn't know, what I never told him, and never told his mother, and never told anyone in that family, was what I actually did for the army. He assumed I was a logistics officer, a paper pusher, something safe and boring and forgettable. I let him assume. Eleanor Whitmore met me for the first time at the Whitmore family estate in Georgetown, 3 weeks after the engagement. She looked me up and down, took a slow sip of her white wine, and said, I'll never forget this. David, dear, are you sure? She's very sturdy. That was the first insult. There would be thousands more. Over the next 23 years, Eleanor made it her personal mission to remind me, every single time we were in the same room, that I did not belong. When I left the army in 2004 to start our family, because David wanted children immediately, and I agreed, Eleanor started calling me the housewife. When I took a quiet consulting job in 2010 that required me to travel to Washington twice a week, she called it my little errands. When I bought a modest townhouse in my own name in 2015, with money she didn't know I had, she told David I was playing pretend. I let her. I let her because my father was right. I wanted to know who these people really were. I wanted to know if my husband would defend me when I wasn't in the room. And for 23 years, I got my answer. He never did. Not once. Not when Eleanor told our daughter Sophie that mommy's job isn't a real job. Not when Eleanor forgot to include my name on the family Christmas card 3 years in a row. Not when Eleanor stood up at our 20th anniversary party and toasted David for carrying the family through difficult marriages. I stayed silent. I stayed patient. I stayed married. Until March of this year, when I came home early from a business trip and found David in our bed with a woman named Chelsea Rowe, a 29-year-old paralegal from his firm. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg. He looked me in the eye, sitting up in the sheets my grandmother had embroidered for our wedding, and he said, Maggie, be reasonable. My mother has been telling me for years this marriage was a mistake. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked downstairs, made myself a cup of coffee, and called a phone number I had not called in 19 years. The voice on the other end answered on the second ring. Colonel Hayes, it's been a while. What do you need? I told him. He listened, and then he said 7 words that I had been waiting 23 years to hear someone say to me again. Ma'am, we'll be ready when you are. The courtroom builds. The divorce filing was David's idea, not mine. That was his first mistake. His lawyer, a slick 40-something named Preston Ward, filed for divorce 3 weeks after I confronted David. And in the filing, they asked for something so brazen, so cruel, that even my own attorney laughed when he read it. They asked for the townhouse in my name. They asked for full custody of our 16-year-old daughter, Sophie. They asked for me to pay David's spousal support, because, and I'm quoting the actual filing here, the respondent, Margaret Hayes, has demonstrated a pattern of financial concealment inconsistent with a genuine housewife role. In other words, Eleanor had convinced David that I was hiding money. She was right, but not in the way she thought. The pretrial hearing was set for a Thursday morning in October, at the Fairfax County Courthouse, Courtroom 4B, Judge Harold Bennett presiding. I remember every detail because I'd been preparing for this morning for 6 months. Quietly, patiently, the way I'd been trained to prepare for everything. I arrived at 8:47 in the morning. I wore a navy blue suit. Not military, but close enough that anyone who knew what to look for would notice. I carried a single leather portfolio. My lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Chen who had served under me in 2003 and now ran her own firm in D.C., met me at the security checkpoint. Rebecca smiled at me and said quietly, "Ma'am, you sure about this? Once we open that file, there's no closing it." I nodded. 23 years, Rebecca. It's time. We walked into courtroom 4B at 8:56. David was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with Preston Ward. He didn't look at me. Chelsea, the paralegal, was sitting in the second row of the gallery, which was, frankly, insane. But I said nothing. Eleanor was in the third row. Cream Chanel suit, pearl earrings. She turned to look at me the moment I walked in, and her lips curled into that smile I'd seen 1,000 times across 1,000 dinner tables. She leaned over to the woman sitting next to her, her sister Vivian, and said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "Oh, look, she dressed up for the occasion. How sturdy she looks." Vivian laughed. Eleanor laughed, and I sat down at the defendant's table, opened my portfolio, and waited. The judge entered at 9:03. Judge Bennett was in his mid-60s, white hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a face that had seen 10,000 divorces, and stopped being surprised by any of them. He sat down, adjusted his robe, and asked the bailiff to call the case. The bailiff read, "Case number 24, DR 4471, Whitmore versus Whitmore." Preston Ward stood up and gave his opening statement. It was exactly what I expected, a 5-minute performance about my concealed assets, my years of deception, my manipulation of the Whitmore family. He gestured toward me like I was a piece of evidence. He never once said my name. Eleanor smiled the whole time. When Preston finished, Judge Bennett turned to Rebecca. "Counsel for the defense, your response?" Rebecca stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed with opening statements, the defense would like to move for immediate dismissal of the plaintiff's asset claims on the basis of federal jurisdictional conflict." The courtroom went quiet. Preston Ward blinked. "Your Honor, what federal—" Rebecca held up a hand. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit A to the court." She walked forward and handed a single sealed envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Bennett opened it. He read the first page. He stopped. He read it again. Then he looked up. Not at Rebecca, not at Preston, not at David. He looked directly at me, and in a voice that was very quiet and very careful, he said, "Ma'am, could you please stand and state your name for the court?" I stood. Eleanor let out a small, amused laugh behind me. She actually laughed. She thought this was theater. She thought I was about to embarrass myself. I said, clearly, "Margaret Hayes." Judge Bennett looked down at the paper. He looked back at me. Then he did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He stood up. Judges do not stand up in their own courtrooms. Not for anyone. Not for governors. Not for senators. Not for celebrities. They sit. That's the whole point. Judge Harold Bennett stood up behind his bench, adjusted his robe, and said, "Good morning, Colonel Hayes. On behalf of this court, thank you for your service." Then he bowed his head. The silence in that courtroom was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I heard Eleanor's purse hit the floor behind me. I heard David make a small, choked sound in his throat. I heard Preston Ward whisper, "What the?" and then stop himself. I nodded to Judge Bennett. "Thank you, Your Honor." He sat back down. He straightened the papers in front of him, and then he said the words that ended 23 years of silence in the Whitmore family. "Counsel for the plaintiff, I'm going to ask you a question, and I would like you to think very carefully before you answer. Are you aware of who your client's wife is? Preston Ward's face had gone the color of old paper. Your Honor, we were informed she was a former Army captain. Judge Bennett interrupted him. Mr. Ward, Colonel Margaret Hayes is currently the acting deputy director of a joint intelligence task force operating out of the Pentagon. She has held a top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance for 26 years. She is, in short, one of the highest-ranking women in the United States intelligence community. And your filing has just accused her, in a public court document, of financial concealment. Preston Ward sat down. He sat down without being told to. David turned around in his chair and looked at his mother. Eleanor's face was frozen, and I hadn't said a single word yet. ACT 3. The reckoning Judge Bennett tapped his gavel once, gently, to bring the room back to attention. Given the complexity of this case, he said, and the federal implications involved in the plaintiff's filing, I'm going to allow the defense a full statement before we proceed. He nodded at Rebecca. Rebecca looked at me. I stood up. For 23 years, I had walked into rooms where Eleanor Whitmore controlled the temperature. I had watched her decide who mattered, who didn't, who was invited, who was excluded, who was worth looking at, and who was, in her word, sturdy. I had let her, because my father had taught me that a person's true character is revealed most clearly when they think no one important is watching. Eleanor had thought no one important was watching for 23 years. I opened my leather portfolio. Your Honor, I said, with the court's permission, I'd like to address 3 specific claims in the plaintiff's filing. Judge Bennett nodded. Proceed, Colonel. I turned to face the courtroom. Not the judge, but David. And Eleanor, and Preston, and Chelsea, still sitting in the gallery like she belonged there. Claim 1, I said. The plaintiff alleges that I have concealed financial assets during our marriage. This is technically true. I have maintained a separate financial identity for the entirety of our marriage, held in a blind trust managed by the Department of Defense, in accordance with federal statute 5 CFR 2634, governing the financial disclosure requirements of intelligence officers. My husband was not entitled to know about these assets. Neither was his mother. I heard Eleanor inhale sharply. Claim 2, I continued. The plaintiff alleges I have engaged in a pattern of deception regarding my occupation. I would remind the court that in 23 years of marriage, my husband never once asked me what I did on the 2 days a week I traveled to Washington. Not once, he assumed. His mother assumed. I did not correct their assumptions, because the nature of my work required that I not correct them. David's shoulders were shaking. I couldn't tell if he was crying or if he was just breathing very hard. Claim 3, I said, and now I turned and looked directly at Eleanor. The plaintiff, through his counsel, has requested full custody of our daughter Sophie on the basis that I am, and I'm quoting, a woman of questionable moral character and unstable employment history. I paused. Your Honor, my employment history is on file with the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and 2 congressional oversight committees. My moral character has been evaluated, in writing, by 3 separate federal background investigations, the most recent completed in April of this year. I have been entrusted with information that could, if mishandled, cost American lives. My daughter has been raised, primarily by me, for 16 years, during which time my husband was absent for approximately 60% of her birthdays, due to what he described as work obligations, but were in fact extramarital affairs with 3 separate women, one of whom is sitting in this courtroom right now. Chelsea Rose stood up and walked out of the courtroom. The doors banged behind her. Eleanor made a small sound, halfway between a gasp and a word she couldn't quite form. I turned back to Judge Bennett. Your Honor, I am not asking this court for spousal support. I am not asking for the family estate. I am not asking for a single dollar of Whitmore money. I am asking for exactly 2 things: full custody of my daughter, and a formal dismissal of the plaintiff's filing with prejudice, on the grounds that it contains materially false statements made under oath. Judge Bennett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Counsel for the plaintiff, do you have any objection? Preston Ward stood up. He was sweating. Your Honor, we would like to request a recess to consult with our client. Denied, said Judge Bennett. This filing was made in bad faith. The plaintiff had access to public records that would have revealed the defendant's rank and clearance status, had he made any effort to verify the claims in this filing. He did not. Your motion for spousal support is dismissed. Your motion for custody is dismissed. Your motion for asset division is dismissed. The defendant's counter motion is granted in full. He tapped his gavel. We're adjourned. Eleanor stood up, her legs were shaking. She grabbed the pew in front of her to steady herself, and she turned to look at me. Really look at me. For the first time in 23 years. Margaret, she said. Margaret, I didn't know. I picked up my portfolio, I closed it. I walked past her without stopping. But at the door of the courtroom, I did stop. I turned around. Eleanor, I said. You didn't need to know. You needed to be kind. That's the part you missed. And I walked out. The aftermath. I want to tell you what happened in the parking lot, because it's the part of the story I didn't expect. Sophie was waiting for me. She had insisted on coming to the courthouse, and Rebecca had convinced me to let her wait in the family services lounge on the second floor, rather than sit in the courtroom itself. She was 16 years old, wearing her school uniform, her backpack at her feet. She'd been crying. I walked up to her. I didn't know what to say. She looked up at me and she said, Mom, Judge Bennett's clerk came down and told me what happened. Is it true? Are you a colonel? I nodded. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Why didn't you ever tell me? I sat down on the bench next to her, and I said the truest thing I have ever said to my daughter. Sophie, I wanted you to grow up loving me because I was your mother, not because I had a rank. Your grandmother spent 23 years teaching you that a person's worth comes from their title. I wanted you to learn that a person's worth comes from who they are when nobody important is watching. She thought about that. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was 12, and she said, Mom, I always knew you were somebody. I just didn't know who. That was 3 months ago. David has moved out of the family home. The Whitmore family estate, the Georgetown mansion where Eleanor held court for 40 years, is being quietly sold, because it turns out David's law firm had been carrying his mother's expenses for the last 6 years. And without David's income, Eleanor cannot afford to keep it. Eleanor has moved into a 2-bedroom condo in Arlington. She has not called me. I did not expect her to. Chelsea Rowe was terminated from David's law firm 2 weeks after the hearing, when the partners learned about the affair and the courtroom incident. She is now working as a paralegal at a smaller firm in Richmond. David and I are officially divorced as of last month. He did not contest the terms. He signed the papers in his lawyer's office and did not attend the final hearing. He has supervised visitation with Sophie 1 weekend a month. Sophie has chosen of her own accord not to attend. Rebecca Chen, my lawyer, my former lieutenant, my friend, sent me a card last week. It said, simply, 23 years, ma'am, worth the wait. And me? I am still Colonel Margaret Hayes. I still go to work at the Pentagon 2 days a week. I still wear my navy blue suits and my hair up and my father's small silver cross around my neck under my collar where nobody can see it. But last month, for the first time since 1998, I put on my dress uniform. I put on all of it. The jacket, the ribbons, the rank insignia, the polished shoes. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, in the townhouse I bought in my own name in 2015, and I looked at myself, and I thought about my father. I thought about what he had told me on his deathbed, 26 years ago. Don't lead with the uniform. Let him love you first. Because if he can't love the woman without the rank, he'll never respect the rank without the woman. Dad, I hope you're watching. Because I did what you asked. I waited. I gave him 23 years to love the woman. And when he couldn't, I finally put the uniform back on. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had someone laugh at you in a room where you were the most powerful person present, I want to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me your story. And if you believe, like I do, that patience and dignity always win in the end, hit that subscribe button, because I have 100 more stories just like this one waiting for you. There's a woman in my next video who spent 15 years letting her husband's family think she was a nurse's aide. She wasn't. She was the chief of surgery at Walter Reed. I'll see you there.